He always said he was tired. Too tired to talk. Too tired to listen. Too tired to pay attention to the details that once seemed important. But never tired enough to work a little more. At 52 years old, he believed he still had time. Time to fix everything later. Time to rest when the hard phase passed. Time to be more present when things finally settled down. What he didn't know was that time doesn't wait for organization. It simply passes. His name was Antonio. Not because he was unique, but because he was ordinary. And maybe that's exactly why his story looks so much like so many others. Antonio woke up every day at 5:40 in the morning. The alarm rang at the same time, with the same sound he barely noticed anymore. His body got up automatically. The coffee was strong, almost bitter, as if it needed to compensate for the silence in the house. His wife was still asleep. His son hadn't had breakfast with him for years. There was no fight, no argument, just the slow distancing that happens when no one realizes they are drifting apart. He left home before the sun rose and returned when the day had already lost its color. On the way, he repeated to himself that he did it for his family. That sentence helped him endure the overtime, the traffic, the constant pressure. "It's just a phase," he said. "It'll get better later." At work, Antonio was respected. He wasn't the most charismatic or the most brilliant, but he was reliable. The kind of man who never missed a day, who fixed problems, who held everything together when things went wrong. People said he was strong. He believed that. What he didn't notice was that while he was holding everything together for everyone else, no one was holding him. Conversations at home became short, functional, objective questions, quick answers. Little by little, deeper topics were postponed. Eventually, later, turned into never. His wife tried to start conversations sometimes. She asked how he was, if everything was okay. Antonio answered with a fine, without realizing how empty that word had become. His son grew up in that gap. He grew while his father worked. He learned not to disturb, to solve things on his own. Antonio felt proud of his son's independence, without noticing the cost of it. The years passed without asking permission. His body began to send signals. At first, small ones, almost polite. A pain in his chest that he called tiredness. A dizziness he blamed on lack of sleep. A forgetfulness here and there that he justified with age. He ignored it all. Antonio learned early that a strong man doesn't complain. That moving forward is more important than stopping to feel. He believed emotions could wait. They always could. Until one day, sitting alone in his car before going inside, he felt something different. It wasn't physical pain. It was a weight. A deep, unfamiliar tightness that didn't come from his chest, but from somewhere he couldn't name. He cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was silent, confused, almost shameful. He didn't know exactly why. It wasn't sadness. It was accumulation. Years of postponing life. Conversations never had. The weight of always arriving too late. When he entered the house, no one noticed. His wife was in the kitchen, his son in his room. The routine remained intact, as if nothing had happened. And maybe that hurt even more. That night, lying in bed, Antonio stared at the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, he thought about his life without thinking about work. He remembered old dreams, plans that once felt urgent and later became distant, almost unreal. He wondered, in silence, when life had turned into autopilot. He found no answer. Only the uncomfortable feeling that something was wrong, even when everything seemed normal. Antonio didn't know it yet, but some choices don't charge interest. They charge memories that will never exist. The days that followed remained the same. And maybe that was the most frightening part. Antonio woke up, worked, came home, and slept. The world kept turning at the same pace, as if that moment in the car had never happened. He tried to ignore the strange feeling that lingered, but something inside him had already changed, even if he couldn't explain what it was. At work, everything continued to demand more. More attention. More responsibility. More hours. Antonio accepted it all without question, as he always had. Saying yes, was easier than stopping to think. But now, in the middle of his tasks, his mind drifted. He caught himself staring into nothing, remembering things he hadn't thought about in years. The smell of the house where he grew up. His father's voice calling his name. The feeling of running without purpose when he still believed time was endless. He shook his head, trying to return to the present. "I'll think about it later," he repeated. But later had begun to arrive without asking permission. One ordinary afternoon, while climbing a staircase at work, his heart raced in a different way. Not like before. Not just fatigue. The air vanished. His hands grew sweaty. For a few seconds, the world seemed to pull away from him. Antonio grabbed the handrail and waited. It passed. As always, he decided not to tell anyone. At home, the silence felt heavier. His wife moved through the house on autopilot, just like him. They ate dinner together, but each one trapped inside their own thoughts. His son went out, came home late, sometimes didn't show up for dinner at all. Antonio noticed. But he didn't know how to cross the distance that had formed over the years. You don't rebuild closeness overnight when absence has lasted so long, even when you were physically there. He began to observe more. He noticed the new lines on his wife's face. The way she sighed before answering certain questions. He realized she had stopped sharing details of her day. Maybe because he never seemed to have time to listen. That realization unsettled him. But discomfort came paired with guilt. And guilt always brings a difficult question. What if I had done things differently? Antonio avoided that question. The nights grew longer. Sleep became lighter. He woke before the alarm, with the feeling that he was late for something he couldn't quite name. One of those early mornings, he got up quietly and went to the living room. He sat in the dark, listening only to his own heartbeat. For the first time, he allowed himself to think about the future without certainty. And the future, like that, felt too short. A few days later, he received a call from an old friend. A name that hadn't appeared on his phone in years. They spoke briefly, but long enough for Antonio to realize that time had not been gentle with either of them. The friend talked about health problems, regrets, postponed plans. When the call ended, Antonio stared at his phone for several seconds. He realized his circle had shrunk. Not because of fights. Not because of arguments. Simply because of absence. The following week, during a routine medical checkup he had been postponing, the doctor frowned. He didn't say anything alarming, but he said enough to pull the ground from under Antonio's feet. He recommended more tests, more care, less stress. Your body is asking for attention, the doctor said. Antonio nodded, but left the office with a heavy feeling in his chest. It wasn't fear of dying. It was fear of continuing to live the same way. On the way home, he drove through streets he used to frequent when he was younger. An empty field where he once played soccer. An old bakery that had survived time. Small memories he thought were lost. He parked the car for a few minutes and just looked. He realized life hadn't passed too fast. He had passed too fast through life. That night, he sat at the table with his wife without turning on the television. The silence was uncomfortable at first, then necessary. He didn't know exactly how to begin. So he said only the truth, simple and raw. I think I'm tired. In a different way. She looked up, surprised. She didn't answer right away. She waited. Maybe waiting for him to continue. And he did. He talked about the exhaustion that didn't go away. The tightness in his chest. The fear of not having lived enough. He spoke without speeches, without beautiful phrases. He spoke like someone who had finally stopped running. His wife listened in silence. There was relief in her eyes. And also pain. The pain of someone who had waited a long time for that conversation. In that moment, Antonio didn't fix his life. He didn't make big promises. He didn't change everything at once. But something essential happened. For the first time in many years, he arrived home before arriving tired. The days that followed were still difficult, but they were different. Antonio tried, slowly, to accept that he could no longer live the way he had. The familiar rhythm of his life, work, sleep, repeat, wasn't enough anymore. The fear he had been pushing away for so long began to take root inside him. It wasn't just fear of illness or aging. It was fear of missed opportunities, of regrets that were no longer invisible. And, above all, it was the realization that he had neglected the very things that should have mattered most. His wife, sensing the change in him, didn't ask questions. She didn't try to force the issue. She simply let him be, and that alone was enough for him to know that she, too, had been waiting for this moment, for him to face himself. The tension that had been present in the house for so many years began to soften, though neither of them knew exactly what to say. The silence was no longer charged with resentment or impatience. It was filled with an almost cautious hope. Both of them, after so long, were learning to exist in the same space without the need to fill it with words. Antonio's son, however, was a different story. He had always been independent. Too independent. Antonio had seen it, of course, but he never questioned it, believing that his son's maturity was a result of good parenting. What he didn't realize until now was that his son's independence was a coping mechanism, an armor that protected him from the disappointment of a father who was always just absent. One evening, Antonio sat down with his son, who had been quiet for days. The air between them was tense. Antonio could feel it, a distance he couldn't cross easily. He tried to speak, but the words felt too heavy. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. What could he say? Finally, his son spoke, almost as if he had been waiting for his father to take the first step. "I'm fine, Dad," he said, looking up from his phone. "You don't need to worry about me." Antonio felt a pang in his chest, a sharp and sudden awareness of how much time had passed without truly knowing his son. Without being there. Without listening. He could feel the walls his son had built around himself, and he understood why they were there. "I know you're fine, but I've been thinking a lot lately. About how I've been absent," Antonio said slowly, his voice rough. "I wasn't there when I should have been. And I'm sorry for that." His son didn't respond right away. He didn't argue, didn't say anything in defense of his own actions. He simply looked at his father, as if trying to understand what was behind those words. What was behind the apology? After a long silence, his son spoke, but not in anger. "You were always here, Dad. Just not really here, you know." Antonio felt that sting, quiet but deep. The conversation didn't fix everything. It wasn't some emotional breakthrough, but it was a beginning, a step in the right direction, the acknowledgement of a reality that neither of them had wanted to face. In the days that followed, Antonio tried harder, not just with his son, but with himself. He stopped hiding behind work. He began to make small, deliberate changes. He walked home a little slower. He took time to ask about his son's day. Simple things, really. Things that had once seemed unimportant, but now, in the quiet aftermath of that conversation, felt like the most meaningful acts of his life. At work, Antonio became more intentional, too. He started to delegate tasks that he once would have taken on himself. He stopped answering emails late at night, stopped staying at the office until the last minute. The world didn't collapse. In fact, it felt like a weight had been lifted. And for the first time in years, Antonio realized that he didn't have to do everything himself. The truth was, he wasn't just working to provide anymore. He was working to escape. And now, he had to learn how to just be. He began to notice things. Little things. The way his wife smiled when she caught him looking at her. The way his son's eyes softened when they talked about something real. The sound of laughter echoing in the house again, even if it was just a small chuckle shared over a silly comment. Slowly, but surely, Antonio was reclaiming the things he had lost. Not through grand gestures. Not through fixing everything at once. But through being present. Through listening. Through being open to what was happening around him. He didn't know if he would ever have all the answers. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was missing the questions. After everything that had happened, the tests, the fear, the restless nights, Antonio realized that the heaviest weight he carried was not in his body, but in the words he had never said. Unspoken words do not disappear. They accumulate. They turn into distance, into noise, into silences that slowly begin to feel normal. Antonio lived with those silences for so long that he almost confused them with peace. Almost. He began to notice small details he had ignored for years. The way his wife took a deep breath before speaking. The way she looked away when he came home late. The short, careful answers. It wasn't coldness. It was adaptation. She had learned how to live without expecting. That realization hurt more than any diagnosis. Antonio tried to start conversations many times. Some died before they even began. Others never found their way into words. He struggled to translate feelings into language. Everything inside him felt too large to fit into simple sentences. For many years, he believed feelings were distractions. Now he understood that ignoring them had cost him dearly. One night, while they were eating dinner in silence, Antonio noticed the television had been on for hours, yet neither of them was watching. The screen filled the room with light, but it warmed nothing. He stood up slowly and turned it off. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable, necessary. His wife looked up, surprised. Antonio sat back down, his heart racing, not from physical fear, but from something deeper, the fear of finally exposing himself. He took a deep breath. He said he knew he had failed, not just as a husband, but as a presence. He said he got lost trying to be strong, trying to provide, trying not to make mistakes. He said he believed he would always have time to fix things later. She listened quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, but worn by years. She talked about how lonely she felt sharing a house with someone who was always passing through. How she learned to solve things on her own. How she stopped sharing her worries because there always seemed to be something more urgent. How she stopped celebrating small victories and grieving big pains, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. She spoke of nights spent waiting, of expectations never spoken, but deeply felt, of living beside someone who was physically there, yet emotionally absent. Antonio listened to every word. Each one was an uncomfortable mirror. He realized that while he never meant to hurt her, intention does not erase impact. When he apologized, he didn't ask to be forgiven. He asked for a chance to try differently. He asked for time, for patience, for the opportunity to relearn how to be there. She cried, a restrained, long-held cry. It wasn't only pain, it was release. Antonio understood that this moment didn't close wounds, it exposed them to the air. And that, in itself, was a beginning. With his son, the silence was different. Heavier, colder. There were no accusations, just distance. Antonio felt his son respected him, but did not seek him out. And respect without closeness hurts in a particular way. He tried to approach through small gestures, simple invitations, honest questions, presence without pressure. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. He realized his son had learned not to expect. And that lesson hadn't been learned overnight. It was built slowly, the same way everything that truly hurts is built. One cloudy afternoon, they were alone in the house. Rain fell softly, steadily, almost hypnotic. Antonio sensed that the quiet was a rare opportunity. They sat in the living room, slightly apart. Antonio felt the words piling up in his chest. If he didn't speak now, maybe he never would. He started slowly. He talked about work, about fear, about the constant pressure, about how he truly believed he was doing the right thing. Then he spoke about regret, about missing moments that would never return. He said something he had never said before. I was afraid of not being enough, and I ended up being absent. His son remained silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply said he learned how to manage on his own. That he stopped calling. That he stopped waiting. Antonio felt the real weight of that truth. Not abstract guilt, but concrete consequence. He said he couldn't change the past. He said he wasn't asking for trust. He said all he could offer now was presence, consistency, time. His son didn't answer with promises. But he didn't get up either. He stayed. And that alone was progress. The weeks that followed were built on attempts. Some frustrating, others small victories. Antonio learned that talking doesn't mean fixing. It means staying available. He listened more than he spoke. He accepted discomfort. He stopped leaving when conversations became difficult. He learned that rebuilding requires repetition. The house began to change almost imperceptibly. Laughter appeared timidly. Conversations lasted a little longer. Silences stopped feeling threatening. Antonio realized he wasn't repairing anything. He was building something new on old ground. And for the first time, he understood that some conversations don't happen to relieve the one who speaks. They happen to free the one who listens. That phase brought no quick solutions. It brought something better: truth. And truth, even when it hurts, opens the path for what comes next. Time did not change everything at once, but it changed what mattered. Antonio learned that rebuilding a life is not about grand declarations or sudden transformations. It is about showing up again and again, even when the results are invisible at first. There were days when nothing seemed different. Conversations stalled. Silences returned. Old habits tried to reclaim their place. On those days, Antonio felt discouraged, tempted to retreat into the familiarity of work and routine. But now he noticed the pattern. Escape had always disguised itself as responsibility. He resisted it. Antonio began to adjust his schedule, not because someone demanded it, but because he finally understood its cost. He left work earlier when possible. He declined tasks that could wait. For the first time, he treated his time as something valuable, not just for others, but for himself. At home, he became more attentive to moments that previously passed unnoticed. He learned the difference between being present and merely being in the same room. He listened without planning answers. He asked questions without rushing conclusions. His wife noticed before she said anything. She noticed when he stayed at the table after dinner, when he remembered small details, when he no longer reached for his phone at every pause. Trust didn't return suddenly. It arrived cautiously, like someone testing fragile ground. She allowed herself to hope, but without abandoning the protection she had built over years of disappointment. Antonio respected that. With his son, progress was slower. Not because there was resistance, but because there was history. Some absences cannot be erased, only acknowledged. They began to share small routines. A walk, a quick meal, short conversations that didn't aim for depth but created familiarity. Antonio learned that closeness often grows from simplicity, not intensity. One evening, his son asked for advice. The question was ordinary, but for Antonio, it felt monumental. He answered carefully, without lecturing, without turning the moment into a lesson. He spoke honestly, from experience rather than authority. When the conversation ended, his son nodded and said nothing more. But he stayed. That night, Antonio lay awake thinking about how many opportunities he had missed by always believing there would be another chance. He understood that time does not offer guarantees, only windows. And windows do not stay open forever. Health-wise, the changes were necessary. The tests demanded attention. The doctor reinforced what Antonio already knew. Stress had been shaping his body for years. Slowing down was no longer optional. It was survival. He began to walk in the mornings. Slowly, without headphones. He noticed the air, the sound of his own steps, the city waking up. Those walks became moments of reflection. Antonio thought about the man he had been and the man he still wanted to become. Not a perfect version, just a more conscious one. He realized something important. He had spent decades trying to control everything. Now he needed to learn how to allow. Allow conversations to unfold. Allow people to be disappointed sometimes. Allow himself to rest without guilt. One afternoon, his wife joined him on a walk. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was different now, no longer heavy, but shared. She told him, quietly, that she noticed the effort, that she felt safer speaking again, that it didn't erase the past, but it softened it. Antonio didn't respond immediately. He knew words were fragile in moments like that. He simply held her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried years of meaning. At work, people adjusted. Life continued. The world did not collapse because Antonio stopped carrying everything alone. That realization humbled him. He understood that he was replaceable at work, but irreplaceable at home. And that changed everything. Still, doubts appeared at night. The fear of relapse. The fear of returning to old habits. The fear of discovering that some distances could never be fully crossed. Antonio learned not to fight those fears. He acknowledged them. Fear, he realized, wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a signal that something mattered. He was no longer trying to recover lost time. He was learning how to use the time he still had. As time passed, Antonio understood that change is not linear. There were steps forward and moments of doubt. Progress did not follow a straight path, and healing rarely announced itself loudly. Some days, he woke up feeling old habits knocking at the door, the urge to rush, to control, to disappear into work. Those impulses frightened him, not because they were new, but because they were familiar. But now, familiarity no longer meant safety. Antonio learned to pause before reacting, to breathe before answering, to listen to his own body, which had been whispering warnings for years before it ever screamed. His health stabilized, not because everything was perfect, but because he finally stopped ignoring himself. He followed medical advice. He rested when necessary. He accepted limits, something he once considered weakness. He discovered that strength isn't the absence of limits, but the respect for them. At home, conversations grew deeper. Not dramatic, not constant, just honest. He and his wife talked about aging, about fear, about the quiet anxiety of realizing life was already in its second half. They spoke about dreams that were no longer realistic, and new ones that were. Simpler dreams, quieter dreams, dreams that fit who they had become. Antonio realized that happiness had changed shape. It was no longer about achievement. It was about alignment. With his son, trust rebuilt slowly, brick by brick. Antonio stopped trying to compensate for the past. He understood that overcompensation could feel like pressure. Instead, he offered consistency. He was there, again and again. Some days, his son opened up. Other days, he remained distant. Antonio learned not to interpret distance as rejection. Sometimes, distance was just processing. One evening, his son shared something personal, a fear, an uncertainty about the future. Antonio listened without interrupting, without fixing, without comparing. When his son finished, Antonio said only one thing: "You don't have to carry everything alone." The words were simple, but they landed differently than any advice ever could. Antonio saw something soften in his son's expression. A subtle shift. Not gratitude, permission. That moment stayed with him. The sense of urgency that once drove Antonio began to fade. He stopped measuring his days by productivity. He stopped equating exhaustion with worth. He found pleasure in repetition. Morning coffee, familiar streets, quiet evenings. He realized routine didn't have to be a prison. It could be an anchor. Occasionally, regret resurfaced. Memories of moments he missed. Words he never spoke. But regret no longer paralyzed him. It informed him. He understood that pain, when acknowledged, becomes guidance. One afternoon, Antonio visited a place from his past, a small park where he once brought his son as a child. The bench was still there, the trees taller, the world unchanged. He sat alone for a while, remembering, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He didn't romanticize the past. He accepted it. Life, he realized, is not about erasing mistakes. It's about learning how to live with awareness after them. That evening, back home, he cooked dinner. Not as an obligation, but as an offering. They ate together. They laughed lightly. Nothing extraordinary happened. And yet, everything felt different. Antonio went to bed that night with a quiet certainty. Not that everything would be okay, but that he was finally awake. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't waiting for later. He was living in the only time that ever existed. The realization didn't come suddenly. It settled quietly. Antonio understood that life doesn't announce its turning points. It simply changes direction when we finally stop resisting what has been asking for attention all along. He no longer measured his days by what he produced, but by what he preserved. Conversations, connections, presence. He learned that a life doesn't need to be loud to be meaningful. Some mornings, he still woke up tired. Aging didn't reverse. Time didn't slow down. But the tiredness felt different now. It wasn't emptiness, it was fullness. At home, the house carried a new rhythm. Not perfect, not constant, but real. His wife smiled more freely. Not because everything was healed, but because hope had returned, cautious, grounded, honest. They no longer pretended the past didn't exist. They respected it, learned from it, and let it stay where it belonged. Sometimes they talked about old memories. Sometimes they sat in silence. Antonio discovered that intimacy doesn't always require words. Sometimes it only requires staying. With his son, the relationship found a fragile but sincere balance. There were still gaps, still unspoken things. But there was also trust, not blind trust, but earned trust. One evening, his son hugged him before leaving the house. It was brief, natural, unannounced. But Antonio stood there for a long moment after the door closed, understanding the weight of that gesture. Some returns don't come with speeches. They come quietly, when consistency has spoken enough. Antonio continued his walks, continued his pauses, continued choosing to be present even when it was uncomfortable, especially when it was uncomfortable. He stopped asking himself what life expected from him. He started asking what he expected from life. And the answer was simpler than he imagined. To be there, to listen, to live consciously. One afternoon, sitting alone in the same car where he once broke down in silence, Antonio noticed the difference. The fear was gone. Not because everything was resolved, but because he was no longer avoiding himself. He smiled, not from joy, but from acceptance. He had spent years believing that strength meant endurance. Now he knew that strength also means stopping. Stopping to feel. Stopping to speak. Stopping to stay. Life hadn't given him a second chance. It had given him awareness. And awareness, he realized, was enough. Enough to live what remained with intention. Enough to love without postponement. Enough to understand that time doesn't wait, but meaning can still be created, at any age, in any moment. Antonio drove home calmly. The road was the same. The city unchanged. But he was different. Not because he had fixed his life, but because he had finally decided to live it.